Hey everyone, welcome. I'm Sarah, Chef Jay as my students call me. However, today we're going to do something a little different. You're actually in my home, and this isn't really for anything but entertainment purposes and just to help you all decide if you want to cook at home. Today was basically driven by, first of all, boredom, and then secondly, I have a bit of a thing for my New Year's resolution. Some of you have seen it on Twitter, and my New Year's resolution is just cook more at home. And so I kind of started that with some soups and stocks and things like that. But to translate it into now, I decided let's do some kind of Italian meal tonight because we're all at home. We've all got some things that we want to do, and I really need to clean out some of my fridge and my pantry and my freezer and also utilize some of our garden, which may sound a little pretentious, but my husband and I have a bit of a garden, which is where we're getting all of our fresh herbs from. So if you have questions about any of the fresh herbs, just let us know. You can always leave a comment on the video underneath, and we're gonna go from there. So we're starting off. We've already pre-boiled our pasta because you do not need a tutorial on actually how to make pasta. And if you're making pasta from home, good luck. Godspeed. However, what we're gonna do today is we're actually gonna focus on a chicken and sausage sauce. And the sauce is actually starting off with a very heavy bottom pot. And we've got some grapeseed oil in here. You're going to hear a bit of a sizzle. This is onion and garlic. And we know how much onion and garlic to use just because I had 4 fresh cloves of garlic. And I wasn't going to let one man behind today in my pantry because I don't know when and what recipe I would use just 1 clove of garlic. So I used all of them. And it may be a little garlicky for everyone, but my husband and I don't really care. So I've got 1 whole onion, and I'm gonna put that into our pot. I'm not sure I mentioned it before, but I'm using grapeseed oil. I like using grapeseed oil just because it's cheap, readily available at the grocery store. And most importantly, it has a really high smoke point to it. So I always get people asking questions about what kind of grease and oil that I use at home. And I do use butter. I love using butter. However, grapeseed oil, when I need high heat, is the best to use. It doesn't burn. It goes really, really easily with any recipe just because it's a very neutral flavor. And it doesn't actually have a strong flavor like olive oil would. Also, olive oil tends to get a bit of that burn fond in the bottom of the pan. That's not too tasty, so we want to keep the kind of purity going of our recipe. And what's going into the pot as well is I had a stalk of celery in my fridge, and I actually decided to do a second stalk of celery just because it looked really sad and was getting kind of wilty because it's in the back of my refrigerator. So I decided to go ahead and chop that up. And also, I've got a carrot in here as well. But these green leaves at the top, if you guys see that in the camera, is the tops of our celery stalks, which I absolutely require you to use if you're ever using celery in a dish. It's a great idea to use that just for the simple fact that it's got very concentrated flavor of celery in it. As you can see how all those plants grow, when the leaves are at the very top, over top of the soil, like it would be with celery, you've got the root, the actual vegetable coming up, and the stalks at the very top are very bright green. Not only does it give you a good amount of chlorophyll in your body, but it also is extremely tasty, and it's that concentrated celery flavor that goes up to the leaves. And what we're doing is we're just sauteing our vegetables. So it's garlic, it's onion, it's carrot, it's celery, and we're just letting that sit in our pot and giving it a stir every once in a while. And over here, I actually have my meat. So because in my freezer, the point of this whole tutorial was to utilize what you have in the fridge, the freezer, the pantry, the garden. So what I grabbed from the freezer today is chicken breasts, and I have an Italian sausage. However, if you don't have Italian sausage, you can use breakfast sausage, you can just use ground pork. In fact, if you wanted to, if you had frozen meatballs in the freezer and you wanted to use those, you can cut those up into bits, you can cut them in half. This recipe is about utilizing what you have. If you've got fresh spinach, throw it into the patch today. If you've got any kind of frozen vegetables that you want to get rid of, go for it. It's really a great way to utilize all ingredients, let them go into the pot together. And this way, if you guys do get to the point where you're starting to run out of some clever ideas for food, this is a great way to do it. So the vegetables are sweating, and this is going to take about 6 minutes to really get them caramelized on the bottom. We almost want a very jammy texture. So if you want to take the camera, come on over here, and you can look into the pot and you can see how that intense heat actually turns that green of the celery really bright. And again, if you don't have celery at home and you just have an onion, just use the onion. There's really no rules to making this sauce. This is just a utilization of the ingredients that I have in my freezer and in my fridge. And to be honest with you, the onion that I have, it wasn't the freshest, so it was on the old side, so it does kind of make you tear up a bit. And that's one of the things that you have to understand about onions, is the reason why you tear up is it actually has sulfuric acid in those cells, and so when you go to cut into an older onion, it has a lot more of those compounds in it that can fly up into your face, get into your eyes. There's so many tricks that I can tell you about how to avoid it, but none of them really work very well. The point and the moral of the story is that you just have to cut more onions and build up tolerance. When I was in culinary school, in college, the first couple of days that we did cooking skills and knife skills and all those basics, it was the worst because we were all crying, and it was not happy tears, we were just crying. And so one of the issues that you have is all of these college students just tearing up. And we thought, how does any professional chef get through this? And we realized that they get through it because they build up an immunity. I mean, it just doesn't affect us anymore after a while. So just keep that in mind. Just keep on cooking with onions and you're going to be fine. So what we have here, if you look into the pan, this always looks slightly concerning for folks who don't typically do a lot of this kind of cooking at home. And this is actually a really good thing. So these kind of burning bits is actually what we call the fond. And that's all the natural sugars that are coming out of your carrots and your onions. And it smells amazing in here, but the most important part is that caramelization is really altering and changing the flavor. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a little bit of liquid and we're going to pull up that fond, which really only comes off easily when you add liquid to it. So you can use chicken stock. However, my favorite thing is just adding maybe just a little tish of red wine, which I'm going to grab right here, and you're going to get a sizzle. And you'll start to see that fond coming up, and that's a good thing. And so now these vegetables are starting to look very jammy and wilted, softened. And of course now it looks like a hot mess because we've got this red wine that's now turning our onions purple, but we're not concerned about that at all because again, this is going to turn into an actual tomato sauce here in a bit. So at this point, we're going to add in our protein. And our protein today is, as we talked before, it's our chicken breast and our sausage. Again, I'm using these proteins because that's what I had in my fridge, and that's what I had in my freezer, and that's what I was able to defrost really quickly, which is really the point of tonight's meal. It should be easy, it should be quick. This shouldn't take more than about 30 minutes to get from beginning to end. And so I'm going to very carefully add in on our high-tech bowl cover, this blue thing, so that I don't splash. But I'm going to add in my sausage and my chicken at the same time. and give it a good stir so that the proteins and the vegetables start to mix together. So as you can see, now that we're on top of the pot, our chicken is cooking fairly quickly, and we don't really need to aggressively stir this pot, but you can see that I'm trying to make sure that that kind of bottom layer of our pan is not burning. And now we're going to add in some of our seasonings. So we've got some pepper. If you wanted to use black pepper, that's fantastic. That's what we're using right here, some fresh cracked pepper. It's about a teaspoon worth. But if you like really spicy food, you can actually use red pepper flakes if you wanted to. Just be careful and remember that whenever you add things, you can always add to it. You can't take away. You can balance flavors and you can balance food, but once it's in there, you're kind of stuck. So if you realize that half of your audience hates spicy food, you've pretty much committed. So I'm going to stick with just using salt and black pepper. I just put in about a teaspoon of salt into the pot. Keep in mind, this recipe has so many variables to it. Again, chicken breast, it's skinless, it's boneless, it's very, 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 very low in fat. But I do have some fatty sausage, some Italian sausage, which does have some salt in it. So whereas I can tell you, you can add in a teaspoon of salt to your recipe and to your sauce, but that may not be accurate. So it really much depends on how you season your food at the very end, and we'll talk about adjusting the sauce towards the end of the recipe. But for right now, we're just giving this a good healthy toss. As you can see, the sausage, I left the casing on the sausage. You can always squeeze the casing out of the, off the sausage. I left the casing on the sausage just because I love that authentic, rustic look of kind of large chunks. Unfortunately, it does look slightly like Vienna sausages, just a lot fattier. However, it's going to be delicious. But if you want to take that off and just do ground sausage, that's fine too. So we are not cooking our proteins here to completion. We're going to simmer this sauce for about 10-12 minutes at the end. So we're not really worried about that at all. What we're worried about is just getting that fond back up off the bottom of the pan. So I'm just using my spoon and I'm just scraping those brown bits off the bottom very gently. But now that I've added my salt and my pepper, I'm going to add about a tablespoon of tomato paste. It's really cheap. It's usually about 59 cents, 70 cents at the most. And it comes in a jar, in a can. Sometimes it comes in a squeeze tube. And then right here, I actually have one of my favorite ingredients to use in any cooking whatsoever. And my husband can tell you I'm obsessed with it. I've been obsessed with it for years. Is sumac. And it is a ground berry. And it has no relation whatsoever to poison sumac. However, it does add a very specific brightness. And it kind of enlivens the entire dish without having to add something like lemon or lemon juice, which takes this recipe in a different direction. But by all means, if you just have lemon juice at home, go for it. And also, this kind of mucky green, looks like pureed spinach, is actually frozen basil leaves that have been crushed up into little pellets and frozen. So I just popped them out of the freezer, and I've got about 3 of those, which basically equals about, if you had fresh basil, if you're lucky enough in the middle of our March weather to have fresh basil already growing, then I would say go for about a 1/4 cup of fresh basil, chop it up, mince it into like fine pieces. But I like the fresh basil, but again, if you don't have access to it, frozen stuff is amazing, or you can always use the dry stuff. And then here's something that sounds really super pretentious, and I don't mean it to sound pretentious, but this is a chunk of frozen. It's been defrosting all day, but again, tomatoes have such a high concentration of water in them. It's taking them a while. But these are fresh tomatoes that we froze right when we harvested them this past summer in our garden. And I always fear that it sounds really pretentious and that people will hate me for saying that I have fresh tomatoes and you should put fresh tomatoes in your salsas or fresh tomatoes in your soups. Like, everyone's got those hanging around. I know that a lot of you don't, and that's totally fine. However, we did have these left over, and our garden produced so many tomatoes this year that we ended up just chucking them in a bag. We canned a lot of soups and sauces this past summer. My husband and I love canning, but the biggest problem is by the time you get into August, you're sweaty, you're hot, you really could just give a crap about your garden any longer, and it just gets to the point where you kind of give up. So we just started chopping them up into pieces, throw them in a freezer bag, and then putting them in the freezer for cases like this. So I'm just going to, again, there's nothing sacred about cooking. I'm just going to take these and I'm going to lay them right on the top. Without any celebration, basically zero dignity given to the tomatoes. Not concerned at all. And I'm going to give this a bit of a zhuzh. Now the cool thing is that even though this is frozen, this is going to start to defrost really quickly. As you can see, the steam's rising off the tomatoes. They're going to defrost. This is also a way that I like to add spinach to recipes. So I'll take frozen spinach, and I remember back in the day when my mother was cooking at home, she would take the spinach, it was a frozen brick, she'd put it in the microwave, she'd defrost it, she'd wring it out, and then she'd put it into a recipe. And I always felt like, even though she is an amazing cook, I always felt that there should be an easier way to do things, and so I thought the easiest way to do things is to just not do those steps. So you end up, when I started cooking on my own, I went to a culinary school, and I know exactly how things are done. However, cooking in your home is much different than cooking in a professional kitchen, so I understand, I can completely relate to taking extra steps. So this is frozen, and I don't really care, because when it starts to defrost, all those liquids are going to go at the bottom of the pot. We're going to get this amazing tomato flavor, and it's going to be delicious. I just want to go through a few tips and tricks just to help you along the way. For one of the things that we were talking about earlier is tomato paste. Again, this is the size 10 it comes in. And it's a good thing it comes in small containers, because typically I will never use one of these cans within a week, sometimes even a month. So the biggest trick I can give you guys is when you do open this, if you're just using, like our recipe today, just about a tablespoon, take the rest of it and just put it into a container. You can even put it into a Ziploc bag. I like to put mine into a glass container, put it in the fridge, and if you know that you're not going to use it, take it and take the tablespoon and just put it into a Ziploc bag and chuck it in the freezer. Just make sure that you label it, which is something that I never do. I need to take my advice on that. But just label it, put it in the freezer, and you can just take it out tablespoon at a time and do amazing sauces like this. Tomato paste is basically tomatoes that have been cooked down and cooked down and cooked down, and it's just this beautiful essence of tomato, but it's very concentrated tomato flavor, so you can go overboard. So you always want to follow a recipe, and you always want to make sure that you don't overdo it with the tomato paste, because it can overpower the fresh tomato flavor. Which actually gets to my other point, is if you don't have the benefit of doing this recipe in the middle of summer, or you don't have access to fresh tomatoes, or you're not those people who have fresh tomatoes that have been frozen the day of picking and harvested and in the freezer, then I would suggest there's a few things that you can do. One of them, just buy a trusty can of crushed tomatoes, and you'll probably need about 2 of these large size cans to equal the amount of tomatoes that I actually put fresh into the pot. Well, it wasn't really fresh, it was frozen, and unceremoniously just dumped into the pot. But you can actually use 2 of these jars. Just be careful if it kind of has a lot of sodium in it. Again, that alters the flavor a bit. It can potentially harm people with hypertension, things like that. So, I'm not a doctor, but I do try to avoid purchasing things that have high sodium contents. And, which brings me to my other one. If you don't even have the crushed tomatoes and you're in your pantry and you're sitting here thinking, Sarah said this is a great way to just get rid of things in my pantry, and I've got a jar of tomato sauce, or it's Prego, or it's ragu, or it's whatever your kids love. It doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be organic. The point of this entire exercise is the fact that you're cooking at home, you're cooking for your family, and what more glorious way to celebrate your family than to provide a decent, healthy, lovely meal for them. So if all you have is a jar of tomato sauce, then by all means, and if you're going to use the jar of tomato sauce, and let's say you only have the one jar, you can always add a little bit more liquid to your sauce just by adding in some chicken broth if you wanted to. Canned chicken broth. I would suggest, again, low sodium. It's always a good idea so you can adjust the salinity on your end, not the company's end. And today, you'll see at the very end of our recipe that the pasta looks a little off. And that's because the pasta that my husband and I traditionally like to use in the house, just for reasons of just health, we try to avoid or cut back on our gluten consumption. We enjoy gluten. I'm a pastry chef. I absolutely adore gluten. However, in moderate consumption, so typically when we do a recipe like this, we know we're going to eat a big old bowl full of pasta. We tend to go for brown rice pasta. And it looks the same as white rice, or not the white rice pasta, but it looks the same as just regular wheat pasta, but it's a little bit darker in color. So there's nothing wrong with the pasta, but this is brown rice pasta, and this is just your regular Italian pasta, usually typically made with durum wheat. And so you do have options with that. I want to make sure that my sauce is not too hot to touch. Oh, it's over here. So, we're going to check on our sauce, which we did turn down to low, and we did put the lid on for about 6 minutes. And you'll see how those tomatoes are really breaking down. And we're getting this amazing sauce rocking and rolling. And again, we're making contact with the bottom of the pan. So if there's any of that fond left over at the very beginning of our recipe with our vegetables, we are breaking that down. Now, one thing that should be said about the tomatoes that we're using is the biggest problem that people have is texturally speaking. Folks have a hard time with these they're like little cigarette rolls of tomato skin. And it's totally fine if you get those. Again, I didn't skin my tomatoes when they came out of the garden. I didn't skin the tomatoes. I just took them, I cut them, I put them in a freezer bag, and I called it a day. I don't really worry about tomato skins, especially when it comes to making a rustic sauce like this, where basically it's a one-pot meal. I'm just throwing in vegetables. I'm throwing in frozen things. I'm throwing in meats. If I had mushrooms, I would load this puppy up with mushrooms. But it's all about what you have on board, and I'm not about to peel a bushel of tomatoes from my garden. So I apologize, that's something that you guys want to have a more purest form of your sauce, but I'm not in the mood, especially not in August when it's 105 degrees. So we're giving this a good stir. And I got a really decent amount of liquid off of my tomatoes. So I did in fact pull some chicken broth out from the pantry, and if this was very liquidy, I would probably say go ahead and add maybe a cup of broth. Or you could even add another cup of wine if you wanted to. Just be careful with the red wine. It tends to get a very strong flavor, especially when it starts to cook and concentrate down. So you just want to be gentle with the alcohol. However, this really does look good and rustic. So at this point in time, the liquid is starting to steam and it's starting to boil out. And so we're concentrating the flavors by taking the water content out and keeping all those aromatics and flavors in, which is a good thing. We want that. However, this is always one of those points in time where people want to load this up with fresh herbs, at the very beginning, and they just want to throw everything in because it smells exciting, and it's just this very comforting smell in the kitchen, and they feel like they're doing all the things and stuff while they're cooking their sauce. Try to only add your fresh herbs at the very end. And that way you're not going to overcook them, and that way you get to really capitalize on the fresh flavors of the herbs versus cooking the heck out of them and then basically the flavor dies a bit. So we want to make sure that we don't do that. So we're making sure that all this liquid is starting to boil down, and it's getting thicker and thicker the more you boil. So as you can see, we've been boiling this down over about a medium heat, and you can actually see where the liquid has evaporated away. You can see its original ring around the side of the pot, and that's kind of a good cue on where you want to stop and check. So the biggest question is your meat cooked already? And trust me when I say, when you have sausage pieces that are about that large and you have chicken pieces that are about that size, basically about a tablespoon or less in a piece of meat, after a couple minutes of simmering, and then we're basically at a boil at this point in time, concentrating the sauce flavors down, you're fine. But if you do get to the point where it makes you nervous and you're just not sure after this has been cooking for a couple of, well, not a couple minutes, about 15 minutes now, you can always go into your meat and you can check it with a paring knife, or you can check it with a thermometer. But with pieces this small, just be aware of the fact that you're not going to get a very good temperature read on it. So just by pressing on this chicken, I know just by the feel of it that it is done. And also, my sausage is ready as well. So I'd like to tell you that you can look at the inside of the meat and see if there's anything that's pink on the inside, but when we're doing a red sauce, it's basically next to impossible and extremely frustrating. So don't worry, after this much evaporation in the sauce, you have very significantly reduced you've boosted the flavors, you've reduced your sauce, but you've also cooked your proteins significantly. Now, before we were talking about fresh herbs, and again, from our garden, we actually have a few items here that we're going to add. You don't have to add any of these. I'm adding them because I absolutely adore these Italian flavors. So we have a little bit of fresh thyme, we have fresh oregano, and we also have, it's these little bits and pieces of green, and they're called garlic chives. And to kind of explain what all of that is, right behind me I have, you all have probably seen fresh thyme before. It basically acts as a ground cover. It's always going to be a very low plant. It's going to creep across the ground. And it slowly over the years, especially by the third year you've planted it, has just basically taken over a good portion of the bed. And the cool thing about thyme is that it has a very woody fragrance to it. It has a very earthy, herbaceous, woody flavor to it, but it's also extremely delicate. And so I always like to put a little bit of thyme in my sauces. But again, I kind of want the star of the show today to be the oregano. So I've put a lot more oregano into our herb mix than I actually have with the thyme. And this, so that you know what a garlic chive is, it basically looks like a very long stalk of grass that has been allowed to grow out of control. And it's a broad leaf, and it's very thin, but it's a broad leaf. And I basically just give my garlic chives a haircut, and you can put them in water and just put them in the fridge just like that and utilize them as much as you want. It's great in chicken salad, it's great in shrimp salad. It's great just in a fresh application, just tossing some cucumbers and some feta cheese with a little bit of Italian dressing or some lemon juice and oil and just a little bit of garlic chive, and it's just an amazing flavor. And when I say it's a garlic chive, it's basically like a very light spring onion and a very delicate garlic had a love child together, and that's this great herbaceous green flavor of the garlic chive. So now that this has reduced down significantly, by about 15% of the initial liquid. Again, not an exact art. Please don't worry about measuring the size of the pot. It is what it is. So I'm going to take all of my fresh herbs. So I've got my thyme, my chives, I've got my oregano, and then I have a very large mound of parsley. This is fresh parsley. It is flat leaf parsley. I don't like using curly parsley because it very much lacks flavor. Curly leaf is great in the 70s, back when we were using it on airlines for decorating sides of plates, but it is not appropriate for this kind of recipe. And if you don't have fresh parsley, please don't worry. Just leave it out. It's totally fine. I actually have this parsley. If you look closely, which please don't, I'm going to ask my husband to stay where he is. This parsley has seen better days, and it was in the fridge today, and I thought, what recipe am I going to share with everybody? And I saw the parsley there, and I thought, if this baby does not get used today, we're in trouble. So it's a little bit wilty, and it's kind of on its last leg. So that's why I'm using it, again, in this sauce. So it's going to impart amazing flavor, but it doesn't actually have to be the most perfect, wonderful, expensive fresh parsley. So just throw it in. And I'm using a lot more parsley than I typically would, just because, again, it was almost dead. And there's no other recipe for the next 2 days that I'm using fresh parsley for. So I'm going to give this a good toss. And this is where I'm going to actually turn my heat off. And the parsley acts almost like spinach. It gets very wilty. And that mound of parsley has now completely dissolved away into the sauce. And it just kind of looks like wilty spinach. Which, by the way, if you do have frozen spinach, great application. You can use squash, broccoli, any of those things. So, come on close to the pot and you'll be able to see how thick our sauce has become. There's not a lot of excess liquid. Again, if you didn't have any fresh vegetables or frozen vegetables that you wanted to use, you can always use things like navy beans, cannellini beans, garbanzo beans, anything that you have canned. This is a great application because those beans will just absorb all this gorgeous Italian flavor. And the sauce is going to taste like you have simmered for hours on end, and you really haven't. You've just utilized things that you have around the house. Now we're going to stop and we're going to take a pause. I just want to get a little bit of that sauce. Oh my gosh, that's really good. Yeah, the fresh tomatoes are legit. That's delicious. When I'm tasting things, there's a few things that you need to keep in mind. One of the things that my brain is going through right now is I know that I'm about to add this to pasta. And I know that pasta can take a lot of flavors and it can tend to hide them as well because you're looking at a lot of starch. And so when you're looking at something like that starchy or potatoes or grits, especially things of that nature, you almost want to over-flavor, over-salt. And I don't mean over-salt in a bad way. I just mean that when you're tasting the sauce, if I was going to eat this as a soup right now, first off, that would be delicious. But if I'm going to eat this as a sauce, I'm about to thin it out even further by adding it to the pasta. So be aware of that. I tend to over-flavor my sauces knowing that at the end, it's going to dilute down a bit. Another thing that I'm adding is Parmesan cheese. Nothing fancy. If you have fancy Parmesan cheese, I think that's incredible. I, however, did not make it to the store before going into quarantine, and so I have my canned Parmesan cheese in the tube, and we all know which one I'm talking about. And so that's what I'm using for this recipe, because I like Parmesan cheese, but I also understand there's a difference between good Parmesan cheese and ready to eat store-bought Parmesan cheese. And whatever you have, again, is totally fine. This is all about utilization and making sure that you are cooking for your family and making sure that this is a healthy, great alternative to going out or putting yourself, in the public when we're distancing ourselves from each other. So we're going to actually add the Parmesan cheese and a secret ingredient, which is not too much of a secret. We're adding the Parmesan cheese. So about a half a cup. If I'm honest, it's maybe more like 3/4 of a cup of Parmesan cheese. But this block right here is cream cheese. And I know that everyone starts to freak out a bit when we talk about adding dairy to things. If you can't handle the dairy, keep it out. This sauce is amazing. You don't need the dairy. However, one of the things that I made sure that I did is to be upfront and totally honest with you guys today. And so what I ended up doing is I went into my fridge this morning and I have a half a block of cream cheese. So again, I don't know what I'm going to do with a half a block of cream cheese because of the fact that I don't have any bagels here. And I also don't have any crackers. And I'm getting to the point where I know myself well enough that I'm actually going to throw this cream cheese away within 3 weeks from now when I find it in the back of my fridge and it's growing green stuff on it. And then I'll feel really guilty and really bad. Or I can say, this would be really delicious and some kind of sauce. And I thought, all right. So oddly enough, because I do like adding dairy as an ingredient to a lot of my Italian sauces that I make, whether it's pesto or a tomato sauce or a spicy sauce, I like the dairy because it adds balance to the recipe. And so this is actually the ingredient where this whole entire recipe started today, is the fact that I looked in the fridge and I saw that we had leftover cream cheese and I just didn't know what to do. So we're going to add the cream cheese, we're going to add the Parmesan to our sauce. And again, just use your spoon and just break the cream cheese down. It will melt, just like cheese. It just takes a little encouragement. And again, this does not change this sauce into some decadent, creamy based Alfredo sauce. This just helps smooth out all of those flavors. Now that our sauce is basically done, we've added our Parmesan, our cream cheese is melted in. And also keep in mind that I did add the cheese and the cream cheese at the very end when the heat was turned off, which is extremely important because cheese tends to curdle at super, super, super high heats. So we're just gently melting everything together. And we're going to do one important last check for seasoning. It's a little bit harder now that we have less and less sauce. It's starting to thicken up gorgeously. Really good. So because when we added the Parmesan cheese, it did add a little bit of salt, but the cream cheese did balance out the flavor so well, it needs just an extra boost of salt in it, which again, I don't want anyone freaking out. And then also, I like to add a little Worcestershire sauce at the end. So you can use Worcestershire sauce, but if you're truly watching your gluten consumption, you can always use something called liquid aminos, which adds that kind of umami, that meaty flavor, and it's also a gluten-free product. So liquid aminos is a really interesting product. It's one of those ingredients that I typically don't tell people that I do use, just for the simple fact that, again, it sounds slightly pretentious, and people are like, oh, where do you get that? I'm like, well, you can get it at Kroger's, you can get it pretty much anywhere. But then you tell them, hey, add a teaspoon of Worcestershire, and they're like, oh, I know exactly what that is. So, to your discretion. Now I'm just going to stir that in. And again, that just added a little bit of that umami, meaty flavor. If you don't have it, you don't have to add it in. So here's our sauce, and we're going to very carefully, because I am not talented. This is very, very hot, and I think if I stir this together with my pasta, it might overflow, but we're going to try it. And let the fun commence. Actually have 2 spoons. I like using the metal spoons. If you have tongs, go for it. You're basically, with the warm sauce, you're marrying the sauce into the pasta. can just put the dry pasta in a bowl and then top it off with your sauce, but I absolutely adore when the pasta can cook a little bit with that sauce. This is all tossed together. This is the end result. This is absolutely delicious. Really fresh and healthy. Utilization of your pantry and your refrigerator and freezer and garden ingredients. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to let me know. In the meantime, make sure that you cook for your family, make sure that your neighbors are fed, and enjoy your time together as a family. Have fun.